August 9th, 1945, Nagasaki. Time stopped at 11:02 in the morning. Dust, thick and caustic like a cement slurry, filled the office of the Mitsubishi plant director. It hung in the air, turning the rays of light piercing through the shattered windows into dense, tangible columns. A second ago, there was order, hierarchy, the familiar way of things. Now, there was only chaos. Underneath a massive oak desk, which had withstood a blow of incredible force, lay two men. One was Director Tanaka, a man of power and position, his face a mask of utter incomprehension. His eyes, always calm and commanding, were now wide with animalistic terror. He stared at his trembling hands, covered in glass and dust, unable to process what had just happened. His world, a world of calculations, plans, and orders, had crumbled to dust in a single moment. Next to him lay another man, a Korean engineer, Park Min-jun. His clothes had been dirty and torn even before the explosion, his face gaunt, already showing the marks of old, unhealed burns. But in his eyes, there was no terror, nor was there surprise. There was only a bottomless black exhaustion and the grim triumph of knowledge. He breathed heavily, pressing himself to the floor, but not from fear. His body was acting on memory, a memory he had acquired just 3 days ago. Director Tanaka turned his head and looked at Park. What was that? He rasped, his voice breaking. Park Min-jun slowly, with visible effort, turned his head. He wasn't looking at the director. He was staring into nothingness, into the very essence of what had just occurred. "It's the sun," he whispered quietly, his voice lost in the growing roar of fires outside. "A second sun." His words were not a poetic metaphor, but a statement of fact, terrifyingly mundane for him. He had seen this before. He had lived through this before. He'd already tried to warn them. And now, lying under the desk in a ruined office, at the center of a second nuclear hell in the last 72 hours, he felt not like a victim, but like a prophet whose prophecy had come true in the most horrific way. How can a person survive the end of the world twice? How can a mind withstand the sight of an entire city's death, knowing you have already fled from such ashes? To understand how Park Min-jun, a simple Korean worker, ended up here, and why his curse became his salvation, we must go back 4 days, to another city, another hell, to the moment his world collapsed for the first time. August 5th, 1945. Hiroshima. The pre-dawn fog, humid and warm, still clung to the roofs of the wooden houses when Park Min-jun was already on his feet. Imagine this world just hours before its total annihilation. It was filled with the sounds and smells of life, the chirp of cicadas, which seemed to have seeped into the very air of the Japanese summer, the scent of damp earth, salty wind from the bay, and the smoke from morning hearths. The city was waking up. Park Min-jun did not love the city. For him, Hiroshima was not a home, but a prison. He was one of hundreds of thousands of Koreans forcibly mobilized and sent to Japan as labor. His profession as an engineer, a source of pride back home, had been reduced to back-breaking work at the Mitsubishi shipyards. He wasn't building bridges and buildings. He was building weapons of death for the empire that had enslaved his people. Every morning was the same, waking up in a cramped barracks where the air was stale with the breath of dozens of exiles just like him. A meager breakfast, a bowl of rice and seaweed, and the long walk to the factory past Japanese neighbors who watched him with silent contempt. He was an outsider, a chosen jin, a second-class citizen. This morning, his bunkmate, a young man named Kim, cheerfully nudged him. "They say the war will be over soon, Hyung," he whispered, his voice full of hope. "The Americans are bombing everything. They'll get to the empire soon enough." Park just shook his head. He was older, 29, and no longer believed in quick changes. He was an engineer to the bone. He believed in calculations, in logic, not in rumors. "They won't touch Hiroshima," he answered quietly. "Too many civilians here. And it's an important port. They'll bomb military targets surgically. This was the logic of civilized warfare, the logic he had studied. He didn't yet know that the logic of the 20th century was already dead. They walked to work. The city lived its life. Children ran to school, their laughter echoing through the narrow streets. Merchants laid out their wares. Wives said goodbye to their husbands heading off to the factories. On the Aioi Bridge, a beautiful T-shaped structure that Pak secretly considered a masterpiece of engineering, they paused for a moment. The Ota River flowed lazily below. In the distance, hills were draped in green, a peaceful landscape. Pak pulled a worn letter from his pocket. It was from his wife. It had arrived a month ago, and he reread it every day. She wrote about their son, about how he was growing, how he was waiting for his father. This letter was his armor against despair. "We'll be home soon," Kim said, looking at him. Pak didn't answer. He just clenched the letter tighter in his hand. The usual routine awaited them at the factory. The clang of hammers, the screech of metal, the shouts of foremen. Pak worked on the blueprints for some submarine part. His mind, accustomed to precise sciences, found a grim solace in this. Numbers didn't lie. Lines didn't betray. In the evening, returning to the barracks, they passed through the city again. It was preparing for sleep. Paper lanterns cast a soft glow. The smell of dinner drifted from the houses. This was the last evening in the history of Hiroshima. No one in this city, not the Japanese, not the Koreans, not the prisoners of war, suspected that the sun that would rise tomorrow would not be the sun they were used to, that the morning to come in a few hours would be the morning of the end of the world. Pak lay on his hard bunk and stared at the ceiling for a long time. He thought of his wife and son. He tried to picture their faces. At that moment, in the final hours of peace, he did not yet know that the bang he would hear tomorrow morning would not be the sound of a shell hitting enemy armor, but the sound of the very fabric of the universe tearing apart. August 6th, 1945, 8:14 in the morning. Pak Min-jun was late for work. A simple, mundane accident that, as it would turn out, divided his life into before and after. He had gone back for some forgotten documents, while his friend Kim went ahead, promising to warn the foreman. The sky over Hiroshima was impeccably clear and blue. The military often called such a sky bombing weather. In the distance, almost indistinguishable against the blue, a lone airplane droned. No one paid it any attention. Solitary reconnaissance planes were a common sight. The air raid siren had sounded and then fallen silent. Everyone had long grown accustomed to false alarms. Pak was walking down the street about 3 kilometers, nearly 2 miles, from the Aioi Bridge. He lifted his head, mechanically searching the sky for the plane, and in that instant the world vanished. Imagine a camera flash, but not the kind photographers use. Imagine that a star itself had exploded before your eyes. It was not light in the conventional sense of the word. Light has a source, it casts shadows, it warms. What Pa Min-jun saw was the negation of light. It was the very essence of light, ripped from the heart of a dying star and thrown in the face of his city. A whiteness that did not illuminate, but erased. A whiteness in which colors, forms, the very laws of physics disappeared. In that fraction of a second there was no sound. There was only absolute, all-consuming silence and this unbearable, divine, and simultaneously diabolical light. The world turned into a photographic negative. Buildings became black silhouettes against a white background. People became shadows. Pak was thrown several meters, a dozen feet or so, slammed against a wall. He lost consciousness for only a moment. When he came to, the light was gone, but the hell was just beginning. The second wave was the heat, not the heat of a fire. It was a sensation as if he had been plunged into a blast furnace. His clothes on the left side of his body, facing the epicenter, burst into flames. His skin instantly blistered. He screamed. But his scream was drowned out by what came next. The sound. It was not an explosion. It was the roar of a world collapsing. It seemed as if the sky itself had fallen to earth. The shockwave, an invisible wall of compressed air, raced at supersonic speed. It ripped roofs from houses like sheets of newspaper. It shattered windows, turning them into millions of flying razors. It lifted people into the air and hurled them against walls. Pak, already on the ground, felt this force roll over him, trying to tear the breath from his lungs, to break his bones. The building he had been thrown against collapsed, burying him under the rubble. Darkness, pain, and silence. A terrifying, unnatural silence that follows a deafening roar. He didn't know how long he lay there. Maybe minutes, maybe an hour. When he crawled out from under the debris, he saw a new world. His city no longer existed. In its place was a smoldering, scorched wasteland littered with ruins. The sky, blue just a minute ago, was now dark, shrouded in dust and smoke. And in the center of this gloom, a mushroom grew. A gigantic, monstrous mushroom of dust and fire, rising higher and higher, obscuring even that second sun. Pak stared at it, and his engineer's brain tried to understand something to find an explanation. But there were no explanations. He looked at his hands. The skin on his left arm was hanging in shreds, his face burned. But he was alive, and in that moment, he understood. If he wanted to survive, he had to run. Not just run. He had to become not just a man, but an animal, guided by a single instinct, to survive at any cost. The first hours after the blast were like a delirium, a fever dream from which it was impossible to wake. Pak Min-jun walked through the ruins of his world, and every step was a struggle. The air was filled with dust that grated on his teeth and clogged his lungs. Broken glass and roof tiles crunched underfoot. The world had lost its colors. It had become gray, black, and red. Red from the fires that were breaking out everywhere. The wooden city was turning into one enormous pyre. What he saw around him could not be processed by a human mind. He saw people, or what was left of them. They wandered like ghosts in complete silence. No one screamed. The shock was so profound it had stolen their voices. Their clothes were reduced to rags, and their skin hung from their bodies like melted wax. They walked with their arms outstretched, so the burned flesh wouldn't touch their bodies. It was said they looked like a procession of ants, slowly crawling from a ravaged anthill. Pak saw a woman with an infant in her arms. Both were dead, but she continued to clutch him to her chest, as if trying to protect him from what had already happened. He saw children crying silently, their tears leaving clean streaks on their soot-covered faces. He stumbled upon something on the ground. It was a shadow, the black shadow of a person who had been sitting on the steps of a bank. The person themselves was gone, vaporized, but the flash had been so powerful that their silhouette was permanently etched into the stone. This sight finally broke something in Pak's mind. His engineer's brain, always searching for logic, refused to work. This was beyond comprehension. This was the work of gods or demons. He walked toward the factory, driven by a final, foolish hope of finding Kim. But the Mitsubishi factory was destroyed. All that remained of the huge workshops were twisted steel skeletons. Not a soul, no screams, only the wind howling through the ruins. He knew Kim was dead. Everyone who had been there was dead. And then panic seized him. Not fear of death, but an irrational, primal terror of the place itself. This was cursed ground. He could not stay here. He turned and walked in the opposite direction toward the river. Thousands of people were heading there, tormented by an unbearable thirst. They threw themselves into the water, drinking it, not knowing it was already poisoned. Pak wanted to drink too. His throat felt like sandpaper, but some inner voice, stopped him. The water was black and oily. Rain began to fall from the sky. Large, heavy, black drops. This rain brought no relief. It was sticky and greasy. It stained the skin, leaving black streaks. People lifted their faces to the sky, opening their mouths to catch a single drop. They did not yet know that this rain carried an invisible death. Radiation. Park instinctively hid under the remnants of some structure. He didn't know why. It just felt wrong. Everything was wrong. He sat there listening to the black rain drumming on the metal. He thought of his home, his wife, his son. These thoughts were the only thing keeping him from madness. He had to survive. He had to return. And he realized where he needed to go. To the train station. A train. It was the only way out of this hell. The knowledge he possessed had proven useless. It seemed all was lost. But just then, the quiet voice of the engineer inside him, which was both his salvation and his madness, whispered, "We have only one way." The path to the Hiroshima train station became for Pak Min-jun a journey through the circles of hell. He did not walk alone. Thousands of ghosts just like him trudged in the same direction, hoping the iron rails would become a road to salvation. But every step was an ordeal. The city blocked their way. The streets Pak had known were gone. In their place were heaps of rubble, wood, stones, and bodies. He had to clamber over them, and every movement sent a sharp pain through the burned left side of his body. Fire was everywhere. It consumed the remains of houses, and a hot wind, which they called a firestorm, carried sparks and ash. Breathing was nearly impossible. Pak tore a piece of his shirt off, soaked it in some puddle, and pressed it to his face. It barely helped. At one point he saw a school, or what was left of it. The walls were destroyed, but in the courtyard a little girl was sitting on a swing. She wasn't swinging, just sitting and staring into space. Her face was perfectly calm. Pak moved closer, wanting to help. But when he touched her shoulder, she fell sideways. She was dead, likely killed instantly by the shockwave, but her body had remained in a lifelike pose, a terrifying sculpture. That image haunted him. The war, he knew, was a war of soldiers. But this was something else. This was extermination. The extermination of children. The elderly. Women. He walked on. His engineering mind, which had shut down from the shock, began to return. He mechanically noted the direction of the destruction. He saw that all the trees and poles were knocked down in one direction, away from the center. This knowledge was useless, but it helped him hold on, to cling to order in a world of total chaos. He realized he had to walk perpendicular to this path of destruction to get farther from the epicenter. This was his first unconscious application of his unexpected weapon, his analytical mind. By nightfall, he reached the station area. The building itself was heavily damaged, but the tracks seemed intact. Thousands of survivors had gathered here. They lay on the platform, on the tracks, anywhere they could find space. The groans of the wounded mixed with weeping and quiet prayers. At night, the city burned. The entire sky was painted crimson. It was an apocalyptic sight. Pak found a spot in a corner and tried to sleep, but sleep would not come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that white flash. On the morning of August 7th, a rumor spread. A train. There would be a train for evacuation. No one knew where it was going or when, but it was hope. When the train, miraculously intact, slowly pulled up to the platform, chaos erupted. The people who just yesterday had been apathetic ghosts turned into a frenzied mob. Everyone wanted to get inside. Pak, despite his injuries, was strong. He pushed his way toward a car. He was shoved, crushed. He fell, but managed to get back up. At the last moment, as the doors were closing, he tumbled inside. The car was packed to overflowing. People sat and stood so tightly it was impossible to move. The air was heavy with the smell of blood, burns, and death. The train began to move, slowly, creaking. It rolled away from the ruins of Hiroshima. Pak stood by a broken window and watched the ghost city recede. He had conquered the atomic hell. He had escaped. He was going home. He did not yet know that this train, his ark of salvation, was carrying him straight into the jaws of a second dragon, to a city called Nagasaki. When Park Min-jun stepped off the train in Nagasaki on the morning of August 8th, he entered another world. It was as if he had walked out of a black and white horror film and into a color movie. Here, the ordinary, familiar sun was shining. Children were laughing. People in clean clothes walked the streets. Trolleys clanged. The city was living its life, unaware of the hell that had been unleashed just 300 kilometers, about 186 miles away. The difference was so stark it made Park's head spin. He stood in the station square, burned, in tatters, covered in soot, like a ghost from another dimension. People skirted around him, casting disgusted and frightened glances his way. Nagasaki was not his final destination. It was a transfer point on his way to Korea. But here, at the Mitsubishi factory, an old acquaintance worked. Another engineer who could help him with money and documents. He found the strength and headed there. The factory in Nagasaki was almost an exact copy of the one he had left in Hiroshima. The same workshops, the same roar, the same smell of hot metal. It made him nauseous. He was allowed to see the workshop supervisor, a director named Tanaka. Tanaka was a man of the system. Calm, self-assured, in a perfectly pressed uniform. He looked at Park with poorly concealed disgust. "What happened to you?" he asked in a cold tone. And Park began to talk. He tried to explain. He spoke of a flash brighter than 1,000 suns, of a heat that burns skin from a distance, of a sound that demolishes buildings, of the mushroom-shaped cloud that rose over the city. He spoke haltingly, jumping from one thing to another, reliving the entire horror. He tried to build in the director's mind his own system of knowledge, the empire of truth he had carried out of the ashes. Director Tanaka listened with a stone face. When Park finished, silence hung in the office. Tanaka was silent for a long time, then said, "You survived a heavy bombing raid. You're in shock. The weapon you described does not exist. A single bomb cannot destroy an entire city. It's impossible." Park looked into his calm, confident eyes and understood he was not being believed. His truth was too monstrous to be believed. To Tanaka, it was just the ravings of a shell-shocked worker. "But you must warn people," Pa exclaimed in desperation. "It could happen again. If they have one bomb like that, they could have others." Tanaka sighed. "Calm yourself. Nagasaki is well defended. We have the best anti-aircraft defenses in all of Kyushu. I will help you. You'll be fed and given new clothes, and tomorrow you'll go to the hospital. You need rest." His words were tantamount to a verdict. Park was deemed insane. He was led out of the office. He was indeed fed, his burns were dressed, and he was given a clean work uniform. He spent the night in a workers' barracks. He couldn't sleep. He paced the barracks, trying to talk to the other workers, telling them his story. Some laughed at him. Others looked at him with pity, as if he were a madman. His knowledge, his unique and terrible experience, was useless. He was a prophet in a world of the blind. And as he struggled in his powerlessness, as Nagasaki slept peacefully, another plane was already flying over the Pacific Ocean, carrying a second sun in its belly. And his life, which had settled into a harsh but predictable rhythm of survival, was preparing for a new blow. But not everyone was ready to live by the laws of the new world. In the director's office, a decision was already forming to get rid of the inconvenient alarmist. The morning of August 9th was overcast. Low clouds blanketed the sky, which paradoxically gave the residents of Nagasaki a false sense of security. Bad weather meant no bombers. Park Min-jun woke with a heavy feeling. He didn't want to go to the hospital. He felt he had to make one last attempt. He had to speak with Director Tanaka again. His action was irrational. He knew it himself. What new thing could he say? How could he convince a man whose world was built on logic and order of the existence of absolute chaos? But he couldn't do otherwise. The memory of Hiroshima burned inside him more intensely than the burns on his skin. He managed to get a meeting. He was brought back to the same office. Director Tanaka was irritated. "I told you to rest," he began sharply. "We don't have time for your fantasies. There's a war on." Park took a step forward. There was desperation in his eyes. They are not fantasies, his voice trembled. Please, just listen. I'm an engineer, like you. I believe in the laws of physics. What I saw violates them, but it is real. You must sound the alarm. You must get people into the shelters, at least try. Tanaka rose from his desk and walked to the window. He looked out at the factory, at the workers, at the familiar rhythm of production. Look at yourself. You sound like a madman. You're spreading panic. That's sabotage in wartime. I was lenient with you, but my patience is at an end. Guards! He shouted. At that moment, Pak felt total defeat. He had lost. He had failed to convey his truth. His unique knowledge, his unexpected weapon, had proven useless against the wall of human disbelief. He lowered his head. 2 guards entered the office. They approached Pak, ready to throw him out. And at that very second, at 11:02 in the morning, Pak Min-jun raised his eyes and looked out the window behind the director. Through a break in the clouds, he saw the light. The same one. Unbearably bright. White. A light that incinerates worlds. His entire body coiled like a spring. The memories of 3 days ago. All the horror. All the pain. All the memory of his cells. Instantly returned. While Director Tanaka and the guard stood mesmerized, not understanding what was happening, staring at the suddenly appeared second sun, Pak was already acting. His body knew what to do before his brain could even issue the command. Trauma had become instinct, a survival reflex. "Get down on the ground!" he yelled in a voice that wasn't his own. It wasn't advice. It was an animal roar, a command. He didn't wait for them to obey. With one powerful, desperate lunge, he threw himself forward. He knocked the stunned Director Tanaka off his feet and dragged him under the massive oak desk. The guards remained standing, paralyzed by the sight. In the next instant, the thermal wave hit the office, and behind it came the shockwave. The enormous window shattered into 1,000 shards. Plaster rained down from the ceiling. Furniture flew into the air. The building shuddered to its foundations. The world outside the office had once again turned into hell. And under the desk in the dust and chaos lay 2 men. The Korean engineer who was considered a madman, and the Japanese director who had just realized that this madman had saved his life. The internal enemy had been defeated by the most terrifying truth. But as they dealt with each other, they didn't notice their real enemy. Fate, preparing its final devastating blow. When the roaring subsided, the same unnatural silence that Pak remembered so well from Hiroshima fell. The silence of death. The director's office was destroyed. All that remained of the window was an opening that framed a crimson, smoke-filled sky. Director Tanaka lay on the floor, unable to move. His body was trembling. He looked at Pak, and in his eyes was no longer skepticism, but reverent terror. He looked at him as if he were a supernatural being, a prophet who had brought the apocalypse. Pak crawled out from under the desk. He felt no triumph, no gloating, only a dull, endless fatigue. He had lived through it again. He had survived. But the price of this victory was terrible. He looked at the guards. They were dead. One had been killed by shards of glass, the other thrown against the wall with such force that his neck was broken. They had paid for their disbelief with their lives. What do we do? Tanaka whispered. His voice was like a child's. In that moment, their roles had reversed. The powerful director had become a helpless man, and the despised Korean worker had become his leader, his savior, his guide through hell. Pak already knew what to do. His knowledge, which had been useless in a peaceful Nagasaki, was now priceless in its ruins. "Stay down," he said firmly. "Debris might fall soon, and whatever you do, don't look at the cloud." He helped Tanaka crawl to the safest corner of the office. They sat there, listening to the sounds of the newly destroyed world, the crackle of fires, the distant screams, the groans of the wounded. Pak began to instruct Tanaka as if he were giving a lecture on survival in a post-nuclear world. We need to cover our mouths and noses with any cloth. The dust in the air now is deadly. When we go outside, don't drink from any open sources. It might start to rain soon. Black rain. We have to hide from it. It carries poison." Tanaka listened to him, his eyes wide. Every word Pak spoke was a revelation. This was knowledge that wasn't in any textbook, not in any civil defense manual. This was knowledge bought with the lives of an entire city. When the initial shock passed, they made their way out of the factory administration building. The scene was painfully familiar. The same scorched landscape. The same twisted skeletons of workshops. The same ghost-like people wandering aimlessly. But now Pak was not alone. He was leading Director Tanaka. He led him along the safest route, avoiding the most destroyed and burning areas. He made him wet cloths and breathed through them. When the black rain began, he found shelter for them in the basement of a surviving building. They sat there for several hours. Tanaka looked at his savior, unable to believe what was happening. You knew," he whispered. "You knew everything." "I didn't know," Pak answered quietly. "I remembered. They had survived. They had lived through the second end of the world." But as they sat in that dark basement as the radioactive rain poured down outside, Pak felt something inside him change. He had saved a man. He had saved one who despised him. But this salvation brought him no relief. On the contrary, he felt an unbearable weight settle upon him, the weight of his uniqueness. He was a man who had walked through hell twice and returned. And this knowledge, this experience, would forever separate him from all other people. They saw the first sign of salvation when the rain ended. But for Pak, this was the beginning of the end. A few days later, on August 15th, the Emperor of Japan announced the surrender. The war was over. For millions of people, it was a day of joy and relief. For Pak Min-jun, it was just another day in a ruined city. Salvation came in the form of soldiers and medics who began to clear the rubble and help the survivors. Director Tanaka, saved by Pak, told everyone of his deed. He told them how the Korean engineer had tried to warn everyone, how they hadn't believed him, and how at the last moment he had saved his life, knowing exactly what to do. Pak's story became a local legend among the few surviving factory workers. But when they emerged from the hell of Nagasaki and entered the wider world, the irony of civilization awaited them. Pak and other survivors were interrogated by the military. They wanted details. What did he see? What did he feel? How did he survive? Pak told his story again and again. At first they didn't believe him. They considered his tale a fabrication, a product of a sick imagination. But when his testimony matched that of other eyewitnesses from Hiroshima, and then with the account of Director Tanaka, their attitude toward him changed. But not in the way he expected. Instead of admiration and gratitude, he saw fear and suspicion in their eyes. His story was too incredible, too inconvenient. A man who had survived 2 nuclear strikes. It sounded like a defiance of fate itself, something unnatural. His feat didn't fit into the heroic chronicle of the war. He was a living reminder of the most terrible weapon ever created by man, and of the complete helplessness before it. In the end, instead of a reward, he was given an order. He and the other survivors were forced to sign non-disclosure agreements. Their stories were classified. Their feat, their suffering, their unique experience were simply buried under the stamp of secret. This was the final, most cruel blow. Surviving hell turned out to be easier than returning from it. It was possible to defeat the element of nuclear fire, but defeating the soulless military and political machine was not. His knowledge, which had saved his life, had once again become his curse. A few months later, once the bureaucratic formalities were settled, Pak Min-jun was finally allowed to return home to Korea. He sailed on a ferry, standing on the deck and watching the shores of Japan recede, the country that had taken his freedom and then twice tried to take his life. He thought he was returning to a normal life. He was wrong. His village greeted him with joy. His wife wept with happiness, embracing him. His young son, whom he'd only seen in photographs, was at first frightened of the stranger with scars on his face, but then grew used to him. It seemed the nightmare was over, but rumors spread faster than wildfire. Soon the whole village knew his story, the story of the man who survived Hiroshima, and then Nagasaki. And then everything changed. Admiration was replaced first by caution and then by fear. Neighbors who used to shake his hand began to cross to the other side of the street when they saw him. Children stopped playing with his son. In their eyes, he was not a hero. He was cursed. In the minds of simple peasants, a man could not survive such a thing by chance. It meant he was marked. It meant he himself was a carrier of misfortune. They gave him a nickname: the man who carries two sons. He was shunned like a leper. It was believed his mere presence could bring disaster. His wife suffered but continued to love him. But even she sometimes looked at him with superstitious terror, especially when he screamed in his sleep at night, reliving the flashes. Pak found himself in isolation, in a prison of fear and prejudice that was worse than any barracks. He tried to work as an engineer, but no one wanted to hire him. His unique story had become his brand. He had won his small war, but lost in the clash with the world. As for Director Tanaka, his fate was different. He survived, and his rescue at the hands of a Korean was a shock that turned his life upside down. It is said that after the war, he dedicated himself to helping the victims of the bombings and, until the end of his days, told the story of the brave Korean worker to whom he owed his life. But his voice was lost in the chorus of official history. Pak Min-jun lived a long but lonely life. He was plagued by radiation-related illnesses, but he stubbornly clung to life. He died at a ripe old age, in a small house on the outskirts of his village, forgotten by almost everyone. He was buried in the old cemetery, but, as the locals told it, strange, melted pieces of glass, like frozen tears, would sometimes appear on his grave. No one knew who brought them. Official history has not preserved the name of Pa Min-jun. You will not find a Korean engineer who twice cheated death in the lists of war heroes. His feat was too personal, too inconvenient, too terrifying to become part of a grand national myth. The story of his survival was buried in secret archives and dissolved in human fear and oblivion. But history does not always live on paper. Sometimes it becomes a legend. It was said that Pak's spirit never found peace, that on the anniversaries of the bombings, August 6th and 9th, two dim suns would appear for a moment in the sky of his home village, as a reminder of the man who looked into the face of the apocalypse and was able to speak of it. Among the other hibakusha, the survivors of the atomic bombings, there was a belief about the twice born, about a man who was marked by death itself, but managed to escape it, paying the price of eternal loneliness. This story turned into a myth, a parable about the incredible strength of the human spirit and the cruel irony of fate, which can turn the greatest salvation into the heaviest curse. Was his struggle worth such sacrifices? There is no answer to this question. He survived but lost everything. He was victorious, but was ultimately defeated. His life is the tragic greatness of a man who managed to build order from absolute chaos, using only his mind and his memory as weapons. This story is not just a chronicle of a forgotten feat. It is a reminder that the most terrible battles are not fought on battlefields, but in the soul of a single person. And that sometimes the greatest courage is not the ability to fight, but the ability to survive and not lose one's mind when your entire world turns to ash. And to remember it, even when everyone else prefers to forget.